What if a place named in the pages of Scripture was not only a story, but a ruin you could stand on, a manuscript you could unroll, a submerged column you could swim around? Imagine walking through wind-blown stone that once echoed with the footsteps of kings and prophets, or turning a page written by a hand that lived 2,000 years ago. Over the next hours we will visit 13 such places, each one still existing in some tangible way today, and ask a single question. How closely does the physical record line up with the text that has shaped so much of Western history? We will move from caves in a barren hillside to a harbour hidden beneath the sea, from fortified tells scarred by fire to a monastery that has guarded antiquity for a millennium. The sites we will visit are Qumran, the Dead Sea Plain, where some link Tal el-Hammam to Sodom and Gomorrah, the Jordan River and the traditional baptismal site, Gilgal, Jericho, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, Caesarea Maritima, Capernaum, the traditional Mount Sinai and competing proposals, Babylon, and finally Megiddo, the ancient tell that later became the image of Armageddon. We begin, as many explorations of Scripture begin, in a cave. On a windy afternoon in 1947, a Bedouin searching for a stray goat kicked at a crevice in the limestone cliffs on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea and dislodged a pot. Inside were fragile scrolls wrapped in linen, rolled tight as if the hands that placed them there wanted secrecy and survival at once. Those fragments would soon become known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Among them was a nearly complete scroll of Isaiah, written in a hand that scholars date to a century or two before the Common Era, and dozens of other writings that altered how scholars understood the transmission of the Hebrew Bible. The astonishing implication: a text of Isaiah substantially similar to the Masoretic tradition many centuries earlier than previously extant manuscripts, evidence of impressive textual continuity. The Dead Sea Scrolls demonstrate that ancient scribes preserved their sacred texts with a seriousness and a technique that left a remarkably stable record over centuries. Cite study publication. The story of discovery is cinematic. Caves strewn with pottery jars, a local shepherd's daring, a layer of scrolls preserved by the arid Dead Sea air. Excavators later mapped dozens of caves and unearthed texts in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, biblical books, sectarian writings likely tied to a community often identified with the Essenes, and one of archaeology's great puzzles, the Copper Scroll. Unlike the other manuscripts, the Copper Scroll is not parchment, but thinly beaten metal, inscribed with a list and cryptic hints that some have read as a treasure inventory and others as liturgical or symbolic notation. Its language reads like directions, caches, quantities, places. It names vaults and amounts of precious metals and places that, if taken literally, point to buried temple wealth. No verified trove matching the Copper Scroll's lists has been recovered. It remains an open question, a riddle hammered into metal 2,000 years ago. Call it a map, a catalogue, a metaphor, a hoax. The Copper Scroll continues to fascinate and frustrate. It sits in the center of the Dead Sea Scrolls corpus as both a remarkable artifact and an unresolved mystery. Site study publication, expert quote, placeholder. Beyond the immediate drama of the scrolls, Qumran offers a second, deeper dimension, the story of textual preservation. Paleographers and textual critics used the scrolls to test how much the Hebrew text had shifted over the centuries. Where many expected radical differences, they found continuity. Small variations, yes. But the larger contours of prophecy, law, and narrative were astonishingly stable. For many Christians and Jews, that finding is not a proof of faith, but it is an archaeological confirmation that the Bible transmitted a coherent textual tradition long before the medieval manuscripts that had been the bedrock of modern translations. For skeptics, the scrolls are equally compelling. an example of how documentary survival can be charted and studied, how material culture under known environmental conditions yields data about the past. Today, Qumran's terraces, cisterns and scribal rooms are a place where visitors can still see the footprint of that community. The ruins of a settlement cling to the hills. The very caves where the scrolls were found remain accessible, their mouths dark against the white Dead Sea glare. Museums around the world and in Jerusalem display fragments. Replicas and digital reconstructions bring the fragile letters back into legible light for modern readers. And the human angle is immediate. The Bedouin family whose actions unveiled the cache, the archaeologists who argued for decades over the identity of the community, conservators who spent years stabilizing crumbling parchment. When you hold a fragment, on screen or behind glass, you hold a mediator between past and present, a hand reached across 2 millennia. If you're captivated by discoveries that bridge archaeology and faith, consider liking this video and subscribing to follow the whole journey. We still have 12 more places to explore. From caves to ruins to the very ground beneath our feet, the next stop sits at one of the most controversial and evocative corners of the biblical landscape. The plains beside the Dead Sea, traditionally linked in Western imagination to the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. For millennia, the Genesis narrative of fire from heaven and brimstone shaped how people imagined divine judgment. In recent decades, archaeologists have asked a different question. Can that memory be linked to a specific layer in a tell, to ash horizons, vitrified ceramic, and sudden destruction traces that science can measure? Excavations at Tel El Hammam, a sizable mound in the southern Jordan Valley, have produced an intense destruction layer, a horizon of collapsed mudbrick, ash, and burned grain. Archaeologists report vitrified materials, pottery and ceramic heated to temperatures that fuse their structure, and high-temperature indicators in the burnt layers that suggest intense heat in a short time. Some have argued that the scale and intensity of the destruction are consistent with a sudden high-energy event, such as a localized airburst or meteor air blast, capable of producing shock and thermal effects over a wide area. Those researchers framed the site as a plausible candidate for the Sodom tradition, citing the right time slice and the scale of devastation. Site study, publication. Such a claim must be handled with care. Other scholars urge caution, pointing to alternative explanations: a large accidental urban fire, prolonged warfare, or environmental shifts owing to seismic activity and human land use. Geochemical signatures and microspherules that some teams interpret as impact indicators can be controversial in their attribution. Stratigraphic correlation remains complex, and radiocarbon calibration invites debate. In short, Tal El Hammam offers a striking archaeological signpost, a city level reduced to ash and fused clay. But interpreting that layer as the literal Sodom of Genesis is not a simple step from evidence to certainty. What the site does show unmistakably is that catastrophic destruction happened here and that communities experienced sudden, violent disruption. For readers of Genesis, that concurrence is a powerful intersection of text and tangible ruin, a memory of catastrophe preserved in both story and soil. Site study publication, expert quote placeholder. The emotional resonance of the Dead Sea Plain is not only archaeological, it is sensory. The wind carries a thin salt tang, and on the horizon the Dead Sea shimmers like a foreign sea. Sparse shepherds and ancient road traces remind you that this landscape has been lived in for millennia. Tourists stand on the rim and try to imagine the scale of a city blackened by fire. Bedouin guides will point to archaeological trenches and to strata that archaeologists painstakingly recorded. For many believers and many skeptics alike, Tal El Hammam crystallizes an essential point of our journey. The biblical text is not always a mirror of precise archaeological coordinates, but sometimes it preserves memories of events and places that left markable traces in the ground. If we step away from destruction and catastrophe to the opposite, ritual, water, and renewal, the Jordan River Basin offers one of Christianity's most enduring pilgrimage images. The New Testament places John the Baptist baptizing Jesus in the Jordan. Tradition fixes that moment, not just in theology, but in geography. The site known as Al-Makhtas on the east bank and the adjacent areas on the west bank host Byzantine churches, baptismal pools, and mosaics that testify to a long-standing sacred memory accessible to pilgrims from antiquity onward. The Madaba mosaic map, a 6th century floor mosaic discovered in present-day Jordan, depicts the region and marks a place of baptism in a way that confirms continuity of veneration at a precise locale. Site study publication. Archaeologists at Al-Makhtas have uncovered stepped baptismal pools, churches layered one on another from the Byzantine through the Crusader periods, and infrastructure that suggests sustained pilgrimage. Hydrological studies explain why the Jordan was, and remains, a compelling site. Springs and seasonal floods create pools and eddies ideal for immersion rites. The archaeology does not and cannot demonstrate the theological meaning of Jesus' baptism, but it documents an unbroken human practice of commemorating that event at a particular stretch of river, a tradition that spans centuries and crosses religious lines. Modern pilgrims wade into the cool current, guided by monks, priests, and local custodians. In the muddy water, they enact a story that began long before them. Site study publication, expert quote, placeholder. This junction of text, tradition, and material highlights another recurring theme: how communities preserve sacred memory. At Qumran, it was parchment sealed in caves. On the Jordan, it was churches built over revered spots. Preservation is contingent on climate, on politics, on war and peace, and the Jordan story is also a story of modern geopolitics. The lived reality of pilgrim access, site ownership, and conservation is as much a part of what still exists today as the mosaics and pools themselves. These are not empty antiquarian spaces. They function as living places of devotion, crossing the boundary between past and present. A short distance from the river basin, across terrain dotted with prehistoric camps and Bronze Age mounds, sits a site whose name crops up in Joshua, Gilgal. The Bible paints Gilgal as an early Israelite encampment, a place of covenantal acts, footprints of a people marking land and memory. In archaeological strata across the Central Highlands, archaeologists have documented circular stone settings and enclosures sometimes called galgalim, or circle mounds. These installations, often low, ringed stone features revealed in aerial photography and surface surveys, are interpreted by some as ritual enclosures and markers of territorial claims, possibly signifying boundary-making actions compatible with the Genesis and Joshua narratives. Site study, publication. The material signature of Gilgal is not uniform. Gilgal, in the biblical text, likely refers to a cluster of sites and activities rather than a single architectural complex frozen in time. In some excavated tells, archaeologists find domestic traces adjacent to circular features. In others, simple cairns and footprint-like impressions suggest ritualized acts. The archaeology here is interpretive. Scholars debate whether these ring structures are primarily cultic, domestic, funerary, or a combination. What emerges clearly, though, is the idea that Bronze and Iron Age communities expressed identity through landscape modification. When the biblical text speaks of circumcision, covenant, and a people marking themselves on the land, archaeology shows a culture that physically inscribed social and religious life onto stones and hills. For visitors today, the low mound of Gilgal is a quiet place where you feel the compression of centuries. A hand-sized stone here, a trench there, a shepherd leading goats along ancient ridgelines. The past is threaded through the present in the simplest of gestures. If Gilgal is about deposit and mark-making, our next site brings us to a city that has long been at the center of debates between archaeologists and biblical scholars, Jericho. The tell called Tel es-Sultan sits at the edge of the Jordan Valley and preserves one of the region's deepest occupational sequences. Archaeologists have wrestled with Jericho for more than a century. From early explorers who saw obvious destruction to mid-20th century excavators who argued for a more complex chronology. Excavations have revealed collapsed fortification walls, charred layers, and a sequence of occupation that suggests the city was repeatedly rebuilt and razed across the Bronze and Iron Ages. In several strata, teams identified a rapid destruction horizon characterized by burned debris, collapsed mud brick houses, and a concentrated layer of ash. These layers are often proposed as archaeological correlates to the biblical account of the walls falling and the city's destruction in the time of Joshua. Site, study, publication. The debate is intense and instructive. Some earlier excavations suggested a mismatch between the biblical chronology and the archaeological strata, leading to arguments that the biblical conquest narrative could not be straightforwardly mapped onto Jericho's layers. Later work, using improved stratigraphic techniques and more precise radiocarbon dating, has reopened questions about synchronizing the textual tradition with the Tell's sequence. In one place, archaeologists identified what might be a Rahab house, a domestic structure with a window facing the city wall, which some have evocatively connected to the brief narrative about Rahab in Joshua. Whether that specific room belonged to the historical Rahab, or whether it is merely a domestic fragment that resonates with tradition, it nonetheless provides a tangible anchor for imagination. A room, a lintel, a window, human-scale objects that make a story feel located. Standing on Tel es-Sultan is disorienting. You look down at a city that was scraped and built and scraped again, and you feel the palimpsest of human life. For the faithful, the layers offer affirmation that communities existed where the text places them, that cities rose and fell in ways the biblical authors described. For students of history, Jericho illustrates how archaeology is an iterative conversation between field data and textual reading. Neither affords a neat, uncontroversial one-to-one match, but together they enrich one another. The text gives narrative contour to the ruins, and the ruins demand the story be read with archaeological nuance. Site, study, publication, expert quote, placeholder. Our journey now turns from single tells to the city that functions as the hinge of biblical history. Jerusalem is both a tangible urban organism and a theological symbol. Its stones, layers, and subterranean cavities tell a cyclical story of conquest, restoration, and monumental building. The Hebrew Bible traces the rise of a united monarchy under David and a subsequent expansion and temple building under Solomon. Archaeological evidence for the Iron Age city that could correspond to Jerusalem's early phase is a subject of careful debate. Excavations on the slopes and in the valleys below what is today called the Old City have yielded fortification remains, administrative buildings, and material culture indicating an urban center of significance in the Iron Age, a city with the complexity to function as a political capital. Among the most tangible remnants from later periods is the massive Herodian expansion of the Second Temple complex, whose retaining walls include the section commonly known today as the Western Wall. It is important to note that the familiar exposed portion of the Western Wall is only part of Herod's retaining structure. Modern topography and centuries of accumulated debris have left much of the ancient masonry hidden below street level. Archaeologists estimate that a large percentage of the Herodian wall lies underground, a subterranean testimony to the scale of ancient Jerusalem's engineering feats. Site study publication. Jerusalem invites multiple narratives simultaneously: the biblical accounts of Davidic kingship, the archaeological practices of city-scale excavation, the pilgrims' devotion at sacred spots, and the inhabitants' everyday life across centuries. Excavations have pulled from the earth coins, ossuaries, sewage systems, and cultic installations. They have also revealed the Siloam Tunnel, carved to channel water into the city, an engineering project that speaks of urban planning and royal enterprise. Yet the most emotionally loaded questions remain unresolved. Where precisely did Solomon's temple sit? Where, if anywhere, is the Ark of the Covenant now? Temple references are abundant in texts, and temple period finds testify to a ritual life centered on a cultic heart. But the fate of certain objects, especially those freighted with theological significance, resists archaeological closure. This is not negligence on the part of archaeology, but a sober recognition of evidence limits. Sacredness, looting, later construction, and the passage of millennia conspire to obscure, and sometimes to erase, physical traces that once would have been visible. Walking the alleys of Jerusalem today, visitors confront a city alive with prayer, politics, and ruins. The Western Wall Plaza narrates devotion. The City of David excavations expose layers where shepherds and kings once trod. Local archaeologists, international teams, and municipal authorities often operate with overlapping agendas, which complicates access and interpretation. Yet, the human element is ever present. School children visit the tunnels, pilgrims press notes into the crevices of ancient masonry, conservators clean coins once clutched by hands long gone. The tension between what we can know and what remains maddeningly hidden is a pulse that will carry us into the heart of our series. We have now traced caves and scrolls, ash horizons that may record cataclysm, baptized in mud and water where memory became ritual, traced ritual stones that registered identity, and walked the stratified streets of Jericho and the layered capital of Jerusalem. Each of these places exists for us today in multiple registers, as physical remains, as layers to be read by experts, as living memory honored by communities. The evidence at each site varies in clarity and in the degree to which it can be mapped onto the textual tradition, but cumulatively the pattern is striking. Textual continuity, physical remnants, ritual continuity, and unresolved mysteries weave together into a complex human tapestry. Some questions invite tentative answers, others demand patience. As we press deeper into Jerusalem's story, into the Davidic conquest, the Temple period, and Herod's monumental projects, the stakes will grow higher. The artifacts multiply, as do the competing narratives. Here, more than anywhere, the past and the present collide. Theological claims, archaeological practice, and political realities all meet in the stones. We will linger on specific finds, bring in expert voices who have mapped the city's layers, and examine the subterranean world beneath the city that holds as much as it hides. For now, pause with the image of Jerusalem at dusk. Muezzin calls, church bells, a child running past a trench, and beneath the ground, masonry coursed by hands that once built for a kingdom and a cult. The story continues, and the next part of our journey will move through Bethlehem and Nazareth to the coastal marvels of Caesarea and the lakeshore towns where other biblical scenes come alive. But those revelations belong to the next leg of the road. Bethlehem sits in the imagination of billions as the place of a stable and a birth, and yet the archaeological and historical record that anchors that memory is quietly complex and deeply moving. The Gospel of Luke 2:4-7, places Jesus' birth in Bethlehem of Judea. Centuries later, pilgrims and emperors sought to mark that spot with stone and ceremony. The primary locus for veneration today is the grotto beneath the Church of the Nativity, a cave with a long tradition of association stretching back to at least the 4th century, when the Empress Helena is credited with identifying and sponsoring a monumental shrine there. Excavations and architectural phases beneath and around the basilica reveal successive layers of Byzantine, Crusader, and later rebuilding. Mosaics and structural footprints attest to continuous sacred investment in the site. Archaeologists also point to earlier material in the vicinity: rock-cut tombs, domestic terraces, and agricultural terraces that reflect a small rural settlement pattern consistent with a village economy in the late Second Temple period. Site study, publication. The archaeology here does not prove the nativity scene in cinematic detail. Rather, it supplies a lived horizon for the narrative. Bethlehem was an inhabited place in the right period, with cave structures used as stabling and simple domestic arrangements that would make the gospel accounts plausible within their social geography. What adds weight to continuity is the unbroken stream of pilgrimage. Christian devotion expressed in stone, liturgy, and ritual for nearly 2 millennia. The Church of the Nativity itself was commissioned in the reign of Constantine and then reconfigured under Justinian. Layers of ancient mosaic and marble speak of an institutional memory given architectural voice. Yet the human story attached to Bethlehem today complicates the archaeology. Political change, conflict, and economic pressures have reshaped the town. The modern separation barrier, shifts in demographics, and a declining local Christian community have turned parts of the town into contested space for heritage, tourism, and residence. For many pilgrims, kneeling in the grotto is a profoundly intimate act. For many locals, the basilica is both a source of livelihood and a fragile tower in a changing landscape. The persistence of the cave, the pavement worn by countless knees, and the contemporary plea of custodians and clergy make Bethlehem a place where memory has been ritualized into architecture, and where that architecture continues to carry human consequence. Site study, publication, expert quote placeholder. A short journey northward brings us to Nazareth, the small Galilean village that frames the Annunciation narrative in Luke 1 and the early life of Jesus in Luke and Matthew. For centuries, Nazareth was obscure in the textual record. The Gospels are our primary literary window into its significance. Archaeology in the 19th and 20th centuries shifted that obscurity, uncovering a pattern typical of rural Galilean hamlets. Domestic rock-cut installations, cisterns, poor pottery assemblages, and traces of small-scale craft and agriculture. Under the Basilica of the Annunciation, excavators revealed what some interpret as a 1st-century dwelling complex. A courtyard house with floors and olive press installations, adjacent to cave spaces later transformed into Christian worship areas. These finds are consistent with a community of artisans and peasants. The tekton, traditionally translated as carpenter or craftsman, economy that the Gospels imply in Jesus' family background. Site, study, publication. The Nazareth material record helps reshape an image. This was not a backwater in every sense, but a village connected by routes and markets, an environment where itinerant teachers could move, and where an itinerant rabbi could find the social roots later reworked into narrative. Layers from later Byzantine and Crusader devotion sit atop these domestic remains. Another case where communal memory selects and sanctifies a domestic footprint. Today, Nazareth is a living, bustling city with churches, mosques, and neighborhoods layered over ancient soil. The archaeological story here is modest yet decisive. It situates Jesus within a recognizable human ecology. Pilgrims visit the basilica, tour the excavated dwelling spaces, meet with local Christian families who carry the slow, generational drag of a shrinking demographic in the region, and hear from local custodians who guard a fragile continuity of worship. Nazareth's charm lies precisely in this juxtaposition, a peasant village made holy by story and sustained by tradition. Site studied his publication. Expert quote, placeholder. From the hills of Galilee we pivot to the Mediterranean coast, where Herod the Great transformed a marshy promontory into one of the ancient world's most ambitious coastal cities. Caesarea Maritima appears repeatedly in the New Testament. The governor Pontius Pilate was based in the region, Paul was imprisoned there, Acts 23-26, and Cornelius received his vision that opened the church to Gentiles, Acts 10. Archaeology at Caesarea has revealed the scale of Herod's engineering impulse, a vast artificial harbour, a breakwater that extended into deep water, imported stone, and sections of hydraulic concrete now encrusted with marine life. Columns toppled and encrusted with coral mark the submerged outline of a city that once floated as a Mediterranean crossroads. The harbour, once named Sebastos by Herod in honour of Augustus, employed Roman maritime engineering techniques that used volcanic ash and concrete to set foundations underwater. What remains beneath the waves today is a dispersed museum of amphorae, masonry blocks, and the iron remains of anchorage systems. Site study publication. On the city's landward side, monumental structures testified to Roman and Byzantine civic life, a theatre, a hippodrome, administrative buildings, and elaborate bath complexes. Archaeological campaigns in the 20th century also recovered an inscription naming Pontius Pilate, the so-called Pilate Stone, discovered in 1961, that provides one of the few non-literary contemporary attestations of the prefect mentioned in the Gospels. That stone anchors a particular historical fact. A Roman administrator called Pontius Pilate did indeed rule from Caesarea during the early 1st century CE. Around the harbour and in the excavated urban strata, archaeologists also find traces of Christian congregational life that match the Book of Acts' description of Caesarea as a place where early Christianity and Roman provincialism intersected. Site study, publication, expert quote, placeholder. The present-day scene at Caesarea is melancholic and beautiful. Snorkelers and archaeologists share the same water. Museum boards explain submerged colonnades. Coastal development and tourism sit beside fragile underwater archaeology. Conservation is expensive and technically difficult. The sea that helped build Caesarea now swallows its ruins in slow saline processes, and yet those submerged remains are emphatic proof of continuity between text and material. A harbour Herod boasted of still returns the echo of his ambition. Conservationists caution that rising sea levels and coastal activity accelerate erosion. Balancing public access with preservation is a modern problem layered on an ancient one. Capernaum, set along the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, condenses gospel narratives into a palpable local archive. The Synoptic Gospels repeatedly name Capernaum as Jesus' home base during the Galilean ministry. Excavations here have exposed the remains of an impressive basalt or limestone synagogue, whose ornate carved stones date to a substantial communal investment in worship. Archaeologists date the visible limestone synagogue to the 4th or 5th century, often constructed atop an earlier, perhaps 1st century, Jewish synagogue. Adjacent to these ruins, excavators uncovered domestic architecture later venerated as Peter's house, a modest dwelling complex that in later centuries was enclosed by an octagonal church structure built to mark the sacred memory of a home associated with an apostolic figure. Archaeology records a sequence: household floors and installations, conversion to a place of commemoration, and later monumentalization into pilgrimage architecture. Site study publication. The archaeological narrative at Capernaum is both precise and evocative. You can see the domestic traces that place early Jewish life in the lake's shadow and the later ecclesiastical response that sacralize that domesticity. For worshippers, standing in the octagonal enclosure is an intimacy with the tradition itself, a domestic spot transformed into an ecclesial focus. For researchers, the layers offer insight into how memory becomes monument and how a local community's importance can be amplified by narrative. Today, the site is managed for visitors, with paths that descend to basalt pavements and protective shelters that guard fragile mosaic and stone. Local fishermen still launch boats in the dawn light, pilgrims whisper prayers, archaeologists continue to test soil for earlier occupational phases. The human axis here is immediate, a small living town embracing its past while negotiating modern tourism and local life. Site study publication, expert quote, placeholder. Our route then rises from the lakeshore into the high, wind-lashed deserts where the voice of Moses still echoes in the imagination. Mount Sinai, the mountain where God gave the law to Moses in Exodus 19-20, is one of the most enduring sacred geographies, yet its physical identification is contested. The traditional site, Jebel Musa in the southern Sinai Peninsula, has been a destination for pilgrims and the home of St. Catherine's Monastery since late antiquity. The monastery, founded under imperial patronage in the 6th century and continuously inhabited by Christian monks and guardians since that time, houses a remarkable trove of manuscripts and icons, some of which played key roles in Western textual discovery, such as leaves associated historically with Codex Sinaiticus, discoveries famously associated with Tischendorf in the 19th century. St. Catherine's library includes Greek, Syriac, and other manuscripts that illuminate the transmission of biblical and patristic texts. Pilgrim pathways, chapels, and a living monastic community create a continuity of worship that spans centuries. Site study, publication, yet alternative proposals have emerged in recent decades. Some scholars and explorers have argued for Jabal al-Lawz or other upland zones in northwestern Saudi Arabia, pointing to different topographies, rock features, and traditions preserved in Islamic and Arab lore. Geological arguments, topographical correspondences to Exodus descriptions, and local inscriptions have fueled debate. Other researchers warn that the evidence is fragmentary, that later theological reading has shaped many identifications, and that the textual description in Exodus is not a topographical survey, but a theologically framed memory embedded in oral tradition. The result is a set of competing hypotheses rather than a single archaeological verdict. The Sinai case elegantly demonstrates one of our recurring themes: a robust tradition and ancient manuscripts preserved by communities can produce a place of pilgrimage without delivering the kind of incontrovertible, datable material signature an excavation might give. The monastery's manuscripts and the endurance of pilgrimage are themselves a kind of preservation that keeps the Sinai story alive, even if the precise summit of the biblical mountain remains contested. Site study, publication, expert quote, placeholder. Leaving the deserts and the monastery behind, we head east into the alluvial plains, where empires rose and fell, and where the name Babylon still conjures imperial splendor and exile. Babylon is central in the Old Testament, from Genesis tower tradition, Genesis 11, to the prophetic literature and the period of Judah's exile in the 6th century BCE. Archaeology in Mesopotamia has recovered spectacular fragments of that past. The glazed brick reliefs of the Ishtar Gate now reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum, the foundation deposits and strata that mark Nebuchadnezzar's building campaigns, and inscriptions that correspond to events and imperial policy referenced in biblical books. Perhaps most resonant for biblical historians is the Cyrus Cylinder, a Persian administrative text that records the decree of Cyrus allowing exiled peoples to return and restore temples, an artifact that dovetails with 2nd Isaiah's portrait of Cyrus as God's anointed, and with the biblical account of the return from exile. The cylinder sits as an external corroboration that a Persian policy of repatriation occurred, even if the theological framing in the Hebrew texts extends beyond any single administrative document. Cite, study, publication. Babylon's broader archaeological story also intersects with Mesopotamian literary records. The Etemenanki, the ziggurat often associated with the Tower of Babel tradition, survives in foundation traces and later accounts. The Sumerian king list and other cuneiform sources present long, ancient dynastic sequences that bear structural parallels to biblical genealogies and memory-making. The material record includes administrative tables, archival tablets, and architectural layers that document Babylon's phases of glory and ruination. Modern-day Babylon exists in the shadow of contemporary Iraq's political instability. Sites have suffered looting, and preservation has been difficult. Still, the fragments preserved in museums and the visible archaeological footprint are potent indices of how biblical narrative and imperial record can reflect the same historical axis in different registers. One theological, one administrative, both real. The human angle here is acute. Museum curators and Iraqi archaeologists labor to protect heritage in precarious circumstances. Citizens in the region grapple with a past that is both proud and politically fraught. Site, study, publication, expert quote, placeholder. Finally, we come north to Megiddo, a tale that condenses the geography of ancient warfare and the imagination of apocalypse. The name Armageddon in Revelation 16:16 derives from Har Megiddo, the hill of Megiddo, and the site's long military history makes the symbolic appropriation intelligible. Megiddo controlled the Via Maris, the coastal highway connecting Egypt and Mesopotamia, and as a result it was occupied, contested, and rebuilt dozens of times. Excavations reveal a deep sequence of occupation: multiple gates, stables, palaces, and, crucially, an elaborate water system designed to bring a spring's water into the heart of the tell, even during siege. The engineering of that tunnel and shaft system stands as a monument to ancient urban planning and survival strategies in a world of recurring conflict. Archaeologists have also documented massive layers of destruction at several occupational horizons: burnt debris, collapsed walls, and weapons caches that testify to violence repeated over centuries. Site, study, publication. The prophetic charge of Megiddo in later religious imagination overlays these hard realities. The tell's stratigraphy embodies the recurrence of human violence, a place where armies met across millennia and left behind the detritus of conflict. The archaeological drama here, gate complexes, chariot-related installations, fortifications, gives texture to the prophetic language. Yet the prophetic future implied by Armageddon remains interpretive. The biblical apocalypse uses topographical memory to make a theological point about cosmic struggle. Archaeology can clarify the past, but not prescribe a single definitive eschatological reading. Megiddo, then, is the perfect final stop for our journey, an archaeological palimpsest that became a prophetic symbol, a teal, where material remains and theological imagination meet, and where the past's violence becomes an image for the future's moral reckoning. Site, study, publication, expert quote, placeholder. If the site-by-site narrative is the spine of our voyage, it's the thematic deep dives that give flesh to the skeleton. The broader patterns that explain how physical remnants can echo the biblical text. The first of these is textual preservation. What does it mean that manuscripts like the Dead Sea Scrolls exist, and how do they change our understanding of textual continuity? The scrolls teach technical lessons about scribal practice. Paleographers note how professional scribes developed standards for copying, from careful columnar layout to post-copy correction, and how communities stored texts in arid microclimates that led to exceptional survival. The survival of a nearly complete Isaiah scroll, centuries older than the medieval Masoretic manuscripts, demonstrates continuity in textual tradition and offers a baseline against which later variants can be measured. But textual criticism also reveals variation, small harmonizations, alternate readings, and sectarian texts that reveal theological diversity in the Second Temple period. The lesson is double. There is observable continuity, and there is also historical plurality. For the historian and the believer alike, the Dead Sea corpus complicates simple narratives of corruption or perfect preservation. Instead, it presents a living textual process, copying, correction, and community use, recorded in fragile skin and copper. Site study publication, expert quote placeholder. Another thematic chapter is engineering and urban planning. The Siloam Tunnel in Jerusalem, often connected with Hezekiah's preparations for siege, and the Caesarea harbor stand on a continuum of ancient ingenuity. Siloam's inscription, a first-millennium Hebrew graffiti commemorating cutting through bedrock, provides a rare, literal voice from the ancient builders. Caesarea's marine concrete shows Roman technical mastery and the Herodian appetite for monumental urbanism. Megiddo's water tunnel and Jericho's fortifications reveal how urban settlements adapted hydrology and fortification to geopolitical threats. Engineering evidence is often the most tangible proof that large-scale political entities invested resources and labor into concrete infrastructures consistent with the social complexity depicted in biblical narratives. These projects required administrative capacity, organized labor, and technical knowledge, the sort of things one expects from states described in both text and material culture. Site study publication, expert quote placeholder. A third thematic inquiry focuses on sudden destruction, how archaeologists diagnose catastrophe. At Tel el-Hammam, Jericho, and other tells, the hallmark of sudden destruction is a coherent, thin horizon of ash, collapsed architecture, and heat-altered debris. In some cases, microspherules, shocked quartz, and melted clays suggest extraordinary temperatures. In others, the evidence can be explained by intense, conventional urban conflagration or long-term burning. Radiocarbon dating anchors these layers into chronological frameworks, but always with calibration ranges and error margins that scholars debate. One must be cautious. Correlation is not causation. A layer that aligns chronologically with a textual memory offers a compelling consonance, but the interpretive leap from correlation to identification, from ash to named city in a narrative, invites scholarly care. The discipline's strength lies in methodological transparency, presenting stratigraphic relationships, dated samples, and geochemical tests so that claims can be tested and retested. Site study publication, expert quote placeholder. The continuity of pilgrimage is another theme that binds many sites. From Bethlehem to the Jordan, from Capernaum to Nazareth, the archaeological footprint is as much about commemoration as it is about origin. Christians and other pilgrims preserved sacred spaces by building churches over houses, marking springs with mosaics, and creating liturgies that mapped theology onto geography. That process sometimes erases earlier material, but also preserves layer upon layer of devotion. The social and political history of these pilgrimages, such as Constantine's sponsorship, Byzantine liturgical structures, Crusader fortification, and modern tourism economies, is as much a part of the archaeological story as the stones themselves. Pilgrimage creates memory that is physical and performative, ensuring that a place still exists today, not merely as ruins, but as a living locus of belief. Site study publication, expert quote placeholder. A sixth thematic focus is custodianship and modern fragility, Bethlehem's shrinking Christian population, the threats to Iraqi heritage in Babylon, the underwater deterioration of Caesarea, and the contested archaeology in Jerusalem's City of David all reveal a sobering fact. Preservation is an ongoing human project vulnerable to politics, economics, and conflict. Looting, unregulated development, and climatic change are modern agents of destruction. Conversely, international cooperation, local stewardship, and new technologies, 3D reconstructions, underwater remote sensing, and improved conservation techniques provide hope. Heritage is not only an academic concern, it is a present human responsibility that touches communities who live with these ruins every day. Site, study, publication, expert quote, placeholder. One more deep dive. We must not omit addresses method and limits, how archaeology and biblical text interact without collapsing into apologetics or skepticism. Archaeology supplies a material rhythm, dates, layers, objects, and text supplies narrative shape, memory, and theology. The two are distinct types of evidence. Archaeologists rarely set out to vindicate a religious claim. They aim to reconstruct human behavior in the past. Yet when material culture aligns with a narrative detail, a named official attested by inscription, a city destroyed in the right century, a ritual installation matching liturgical description, a consilience occurs that strengthens historical plausibility for the account's anchors. At the same time, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The Ark of the Covenant's fate, the Copper Scroll's treasure, and Sinai's summit location remain unresolved, precisely because material traces are ambiguous or missing. Responsible interpretation respects both the archaeological method and the text's theological purpose. Site study, site publication, expert, quote, placeholder. As our special sections conclude, the narrative pressure returns to Jerusalem, already introduced as a pivot, and there we reach an emotional and evidentiary apex. Jerusalem has been excavated in seams, every trench cuts a story. The Second Temple's massive retaining walls, Herodian masonry coursing around the Temple Mount platform, the Siloam waterworks, and tiny domestic finds like ostraca and coins all form a dense textual material web. Yet some objects that carry disproportionate theological weight remain frustratingly absent. The Ark of the Covenant is the most famous example, described in detail in the Pentateuch and Kings. It was later unaccounted for in the post-exilic literature. Hypotheses abound: secret hiding, removal to Babylon, concealment in subterranean chambers, or transportation to places like Ethiopia. But none currently reaches archaeological consensus. The fact that such an item resists discovery is an important point. Absence can be a result of deliberate concealment, later destruction, or simply the limits of excavation. This ambiguity is profoundly human. It is the place where faith, memory, and material frustration intersect. Site, study, publication, expert quote, placeholder. Archaeology cannot always retrieve soul objects. It can, however, retrieve the scaffolding of ritual life, altars, cultic vessels, temple-era pottery, and administrative lists. Those items corroborate the existence of ritual systems described in the texts, and they document the bureaucratic and economic life that sustained them. Jerusalem's layers reveal a city capable of monumental religion and bureaucratic complexity. The emotional core of our project, that a sacred text memory can leave physical footprints, is nowhere more palpable. Yet the city also illustrates the limits of archaeology, because sacred architecture often becomes the site of later sanctification and reuse, and because modern politics restricts where and how excavation may proceed. The result is a city that speaks loudly and yet keeps its deepest secrets. In the end, our voyage arrives where it must, to Megiddo again, not merely as an archaeological tell, but as a prophetic shorthand for war and finality. The tell's many battle horizons and its strategic geography made it a fitting image for Revelation's climactic plain. The excavation record at Megiddo, gates that suggest established city planning, stables that align with chariotry needs, granaries and administrative quarters, is also a record of repeated conflict. The water tunnel, cut with human labor to secure a spring during siege, sums up a civilization's persistence in the face of recurring violence. Walking Megiddo's terraces today, you look across a valley that has seen chariots, infantry, and modern armies. You stand where society repeatedly rebuilt itself after ruin. Revelation's use of the site is therefore not arbitrary. It draws on a concrete memory of places where decisive contests were fought. Archaeology gives that memory weight. It does not determine prophecy's truth claims, but it demonstrates the human reality to which poetic and theological language refers. Site study, chart publication, expert, quote, placeholder. So what conclusion do we draw from these 13 places that still exist today? In caves and columns, in manuscripts and mosaics. First, pattern matters. Across a wide sweep of sites and time periods, archaeology repeatedly yields a profile compatible with the Bible's basic geographic, social, and political outlines. Cities existed where the texts place them. States had the infrastructure and administrators that the books imply. Ritual installations and long lines of devotion leave material traces. These convergences do not constitute metaphysical proof. Rather, they create a robust historical scaffolding that makes the biblical narratives intelligible as memory, literature, and social action. Second, mystery persists. Items and events charged with theological intensity, the Copper Scrolls treasure, the Ark, the summit of Sinai, remain open questions, a reminder that the past resists total capture by science. Third, human consequence endures. Modern custodianship, local communities, political realities, and tourism economies shape how these sites live and breathe today. When you stand at the Western Wall, descend into Qumran's caves, wade the Jordan, or swim over Caesarea's submerged colonnade, you encounter not only ruins, but living stories and contested histories. Site study at publication. Expert, quote, placeholder. If archaeology has a humility to teach, it is this. Evidence can illuminate and dignify the ancient text without cancelling the existential choices faith asks of a person. For believers, material corroboration may bolster confidence that the narratives are anchored in history. For skeptics, the finds show that the ancient authors were writing about real places and practices. For historians, archaeology remains a disciplined craft that builds models of the past with provisional claims and peer review. Across our journey, the refrain returns: textual continuity, physical remains, ritual continuity, and unresolved mysteries interweave to form a human tapestry that resists simplistic answers. Before we leave the hilltops and the harbors, imagine once more key images from our trip. The brittle curl of an Isaiah fragment in a museum vitrine, the glint of basalt turned to a synagogue's carved stone, a coral-encrusted column sleeping beneath Mediterranean waves, an ash horizon that tells of a sudden terrible night, and the low, repeated terraces of a tell, where armies met across millennia. These are not merely curiosities to satisfy antiquarian interest. They are pieces of the human record, traces of sorrow and joy, belief and doubt, building and destruction. They remind us that the past is not inert. It is embodied in places people still tend, guard, and mourn. If this voyage has left you surprised by how many biblical places can still be touched, read, or circled by boat, consider exploring further. We've barely scratched the surface of the objects and artifacts that connected people to these stories. If you want to continue the conversation, watch our deep visual study on the 10 Objects of Jesus, a companion piece that examines the material culture that shaped Jesus' world and how objects can carry theological meaning across centuries. Leave a comment below. Which of the 13 sites surprised you most, and what question would you want an archaeologist to answer if they could return to the field tomorrow? If this journey resonated, like and share so others can explore these living landscapes of faith and history with us. We close not with certainty but with invitation. The ruins remain, the manuscripts persist, and the questions endure. These 13 places still exist today, and in their stones and scrolls they keep speaking. The work of listening, of excavating carefully, reading charitably, and stewarding responsibly continues.